I'm Joshua Bardwell, and you're going to learn something today. Today, we're going to talk about dynamic range. What is dynamic range? You hear camera manufacturers talk about wide dynamic range. It's kind of a big deal. Let's figure out why. If you look at the marketing materials for cameras like the Runcam Eagle and the Runcam 3, you'll hear them talking about wide dynamic range. And you'll also hear this topic come up when you talk about the GoPro ProTune flat mode. When you use ProTune flat on a GoPro, you're able to get more dynamic range out of your picture. But what is dynamic range? Dynamic range refers to the difference between the brightest and the darkest thing that the camera can capture. And in order to make that make sense, I'm going to give you some examples. I've selected this picture for our example because it is a picture that has a lot of dynamic range. So what I mean by that is that it's got a lot of bright things like the sunlight glinting off these leaves and the sunlight right here in the grass. And it's got a lot of dark shadow values like the shadows here and especially here in the bushes. If we compare that to an image like this one, this is a very flat image, you could call it. It's a picture that does not have a lot of contrast or dynamic range. And this plays out in reality as well. So it's not just the examples that I've picked. This is not just a hypothetical classroom example. The real world implication is that when you're using your camera on a very bright sunny day, but there's also shadows under trees, for example, a camera with more dynamic range is going to do better in that situation. And when you're using your camera on like a cloudy day where there's not a lot of contrast, the dynamic range of the camera matters a little bit less. But let's take a look at what dynamic range actually is. What I can do here is I can adjust these sliders to adjust where the bottom and the top of the luminosity scale is for this image. So watch what happens. It'll make sense when you see it happen. I'm going to move this bottom slider up, and what you're going to see is that the dark parts of the image, instead of containing detail, begin to go black. They sort of drop off the bottom of the scale. Watch carefully. The darker parts of the image are getting darker and becoming black. And as I continue to move the slider, more and more of the image becomes black. We are reducing the dynamic range of the image. Okay? We can do that at the top end as well. So I can reduce the top end. The bright parts of the image will get brighter and brighter. And eventually, in photography, it's called getting blown out. They'll get blown out, so they'll just essentially become white. Okay? And in each case, we are reducing the dynamic range of the image. So to sum that up, we could imagine that the dynamic range of the camera is the distance between these sliders. And anything that is brighter than this point will be overexposed, will just show as white. It'll be blown out. And anything that's darker than this is going to be black or lost in shadow. And we can adjust the exposure of the camera up or down to control which parts of the scene are visible and which parts are overexposed and which parts are underexposed, but we can't extend these out. If we look at the other picture, we can see that on a low contrast image, the effect is a little different. Here's a relatively low contrast image, and you can see if I reduce the top end, the sky will get blown out, will get overexposed and blown out. And the rest of the scene will actually become much brighter. And right now we are really properly exposing this part of the scene, but the sky is getting completely blown out. And this is a great example of what I've seen when using a wide dynamic range camera, like in the most recent case, the Runcam 3. The Runcam 3 was able to expose for both the sky and the ground more correctly because it has a wider dynamic range. So as we open up the dynamic range, we simulate that effect, and we bring both the sky and the ground into view, as opposed to, for example, the ground being lost in shadow and only being able to see the sky. Well, that is a terrible, terrible example. Hey, here's a crazy idea. Let's use an actual camera to demonstrate this concept. I wanted to show you guys the sliders so you got a concept of what's going on. But now, this is a Runcam Swift Mini. I'm going to tweak the settings, and then I'm going to really just show you how the dynamic range plays out in the actual camera. Because this camera lets us, as you see me doing here, turn the wide dynamic range on and off. Now this is not as good a wide dynamic range as you'll see on the Runcam Eagle and the Runcam 3, but it will demonstrate the concept very well. I want you to look at my desk in the lower right and see that when the WDR is off, it just looks like a shadowy blob. When the WDR is on, as it is now, you can see the details in the wood grain. You can also choose any other highlight or shadow part of the image, and look at how it changes when WDR is off versus on. Details get lost in the shadows and blown out in the highlights. Now I'm going to tweak the shutter settings here in a minute, and I'm going to manually set the shutter to expose the image. Now this is a really underexposed image, and I'm going to set the automatic gain control to off so that the camera is as constant as possible. Now notice here that the image is super underexposed. It's all just in dark. You can basically just see the brightest of the lights. And I'm going to turn the exposure up until I start to bring some of the details back into the image, but the image is still very, very underexposed. Now at this point I'm going to turn the wide dynamic range on and look at the difference. It brings in so much detail that was lost in the shadow before. I want you to understand that this is not simply increasing the exposure. Watch, I can turn the exposure up and the image will get brighter, but lots of detail is still lost in shadow. When I turn the wide dynamic range on, that shadow detail comes out. In theory, wide dynamic range should also increase highlight detail. It just depends on exactly how the algorithm is implemented. So that's the concept of dynamic range. When we talk about a camera having wide dynamic range, what it means is that it can capture brighter highlights and darker shadows at the same time. Essentially, it is compressing this information down into the dynamic range of your display. It is making the shadows brighter and making the highlights darker so that everything gets sort of closer together, and your display is able to show all of the information, all the details in the clouds and all the details in the shadows under the tree at the same time. That's what wide dynamic range is. As you become more familiar with this concept, you may be able to learn to recognize a wide dynamic range image. You'll get it if you spend a lot of time looking at film and photography. You start to kind of get a sense of what the typical dynamic range of a medium is, and then you see these wide dynamic range images and you go, oh, now I see what's going on there. There's even a thing, this is not related to quadcopters, but there's even a thing out there called high dynamic range, or HDR photography, which is a method of compositing multiple images together to create a photograph that has shadow detail and highlight detail that simply could not be captured by any sensor anywhere. If you do a web search for HDR photography, you're going to see some examples of that. And that's just a more extreme example of what we're talking about when we see a camera like the Runcam 3 or the Runcam Eagle say that it has HDR, or high dynamic range. Now, one effect of high dynamic range is that you also get reduced contrast. You're fitting brighter brights and darker darks into the dynamic range of the display. Remember, I said the display itself has a certain dynamic range. It can only display so bright of a white and so dark of a black, and it can't do any more. So if the camera is going to take this amount of dynamic range instead of this amount, the camera has to compress it down to fit it into what your display is capable of showing. And the net effect is that there's less contrast in the image. And this is why I think some people really prefer the standard dynamic range images from cameras like the Swift. Setting aside the issue of the digital imaging that you see in the Eagle, for example, the Runcam 3 doesn't have that issue. Some people really prefer standard dynamic range issues because they would rather see dark shadows and bright highlights, and they don't care about the fact that they're losing some details. For some people, the additional contrast is very worth it. And this is especially true for some FPV pilots who feel that the higher contrast of the standard dynamic range cameras makes it easier for them to see scraggle, right? Because that little twig, instead of being a kind of a grayish twig that you might miss, it's a black streak and you're more likely to see the scraggle. That's a matter of personal preference. The flip side of that is that with a high dynamic range camera, when you're flying from a sunny field under some trees, you'll be able to see the detail in the shadows under the trees before you get there. Whereas with a standard dynamic range camera, you'll just see a black shadow until you get under the trees, and then the camera's exposure algorithm adjusts to the lighting under the trees, and then you'll be able to see details. So I feel like it's a bit of a trade-off, and what you like best depends on, well, your personal preferences and where you fly. That's going to do it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed learning about what dynamic range is and why wide dynamic range might be a good thing depending on your personal preferences, right? Thanks for watching. Leave any comments or questions you have down in the comments. And as always, happy flying.